Caro publico, Who is Afraid of Virginia Woolf? Vous connaissez tout, vous connaissez tout ce titre-là. Et moi, j'étais un peu afraid of Eva Illouz quand j'ai acheté il y a longtemps le livre Warum Liebe wehtut. Mais c'était tout à fait ma faute, parce que moi, quand j'étais tout jeune, j'ai lu Pierre Bourdieu, Die feinen Unterschiede, la distinction. Et là, il m'a expliqué pourquoi quelqu'un comme moi, qui aime lire Flaubert, et aussi un type qui aime à écouter Glenn Gould jouant les Goldberg-Variationen. Et je me disais, c'est pas possible que ce mec-là, il me détruit toutes mes illusions sur mon expérience intérieure quand je lis Flaubert, Emma Bovary, etc., etc. Et je voulais plus rien savoir de la sociologie. J'ai quand même acheté ce livre et il était pendant presque 20 ans dans mon armoire. Et là, j'étais forcé pour une exposition de lire Die Errettung der modernen Seele, un livre sur Freud et l'Amérique, et j'étais totalement flabbergasted. I was a little bit falling in love avec la sociologie. Je change un peu entre les langues. Et j'ai commencé tout de suite à lire d'autres livres de Eva Illouz. Et j'ai rencontré Monsieur Theisohn. Et je lui dis, ce serait peut-être pas mal d'inviter Eva Illouz pour ce Dance Me to the End of Love. Est-ce que tu connais? Oui, bien sûr, je connais, j'ai tout lu, comme il connaît toujours tout. Et puis j'ai commencé aussi à lire Explosive moderne, le dernier livre, où il y a tout juste au commencement aussi une citation de Michel Houellebecq. Et puis j'étais totalement fasciné par cette approche à la sociologie, non seulement dans un sens scientifique, mais elle prend toujours des livres comme Emma Bovary de Flaubert, La Belle du Seigneur de Albert Cohen, elle cite aussi Nietzsche, même Georges Bataille. Et là, elle m'a quand même expliqué comment mon amour ou mes amours sont influencés par la société, par le capitalisme et tout ça, mais qu'il y a quand même une possibilité aussi de résister en lisant par exemple Georges Bataille. Il y a quand même un amour ou un vouloir de dépense et de ne pas suivre toujours cette calculation des sentiments. Et je suis très curieux de votre entretien avec Monsieur Theisohn, und er ist, ich habe das gestern schon gesagt, Professor für Neue Deutsche Literatur in Zürich. Ich habe auch gestern schon gesagt, was er alles weiß. Das ist eine lange Geschichte, dass es ihm eben auch gelingt, alte Figuren aus der Schweizer Literaturgeschichte eben zu aktuellen Autoren zu machen. Er hat auch ganz verwegen ein Nachwort mit Dietmar Datt zu Nick Land publiziert, einem Philosophen, der die neue und neueste Rechte in Amerika beflügelt, der sich absurderweise auch auf Bataille und Nietzsche und so bezieht. Da kann man wunderbar stundenlang mit ihm abschweifen, aber ich werde keine Sekunde mehr länger abschweifen, weil er das viel besser kann als ich, und ich wünsche Ihnen allen ein spannendes Gespräch und nicht allzu viel Desillusionierung.
Merci, merci beaucoup.
So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm quite happy to sit here next to Eva Illouz, since she brings me back to my youth, or somehow she throws me back to younger days, since what we noticed when I was in the 20 years ago, in the 2000s, when I did my PhD in Jerusalem. Actually, Eva was also there, but we didn't meet. But somehow I knew her, since I was somehow occupied by a trend within my subject, which was called languages of emotion. There were big clusters in research about languages of emotions, and she was and is the leading scholars concerning the languages of emotions. And this was the first book I bought from the hand of Eva Illouz. It's in German. It's Gefühle in Zeiten des Kapitalismus. These are the so-called Adorno-Vorlesungen she held in Frankfurt in 2004. And starting with Gefühle in Zeiten des Kapitalismus, we just talked. And Eva told me that actually she doesn't like that all the German publishers have to, or the German publisher always has to put Gefühle or emotions in the title. Why is that a problem?
No, I didn't say German,
Yeah.
by the way.
Yeah.
I mean, because in this book, for example,
Yeah.
they didn't.
They didn't.
But the American one, Princeton University Press, insisted they would.
Yeah.
So what was the question? Yeah, because I get confused with my books myself.
Yeah.
I no longer know which is what because it's
Yeah.
all about emotions.
All about emotions, so they should have different titles. Okay, so with this one, the German publisher, which is Surkamp, did something right, because in English it's called Explosive Emotions, right?
Right.
In German it's called Explosive Moderne. So to make a path into this book, what do you think, what does what distinguishes the emotional culture of modernity from the emotional culture of the pre-modern era?
So, first of all, I need to establish that one of the central claims of sociologists is that emotions are influenced by collective phenomena and they influence back collective phenomena. So, for example, in the 18th century, if you look at, since we are talking, this is a literary festival, if you look at Rousseau, Rousseau cries all the time in the Confessions, in his Rêverie d'un promeneur solitaire, not far from here, he cries all the time. And it's a trope of the 18th century literature that men cry, cry, cry. And they cry because it's a way to show that they have a higher soul, form of sensibility. All this ends in the middle of the 19th century. It's just one example of how emotions and emotional experiences shift, how they are attached to class and how they are attached to gender, because the tears afterwards will certainly not be male and they will be mostly female, and they will not reflect a higher sensibility. They will reflect something very sad or a kind of collapse of the self. And they can also, emotions influence collectivity. For example, think of Mohamed Bouazizi, the Tunisian vendor who in 2001 set himself ablaze. And when because a policeman in Tunisia demanded a bribe for him to continue selling fruits and vegetables. He refused. And when he refused, he was slapped by a policewoman. He went to the authorities to complain. The authorities threw him out and even further humiliated him. So he set himself ablaze. And when he set himself ablaze, the story was picked up by Al Jazeera. And this was one of the sources of the huge movement which we have called the Arab Spring of 2011. So having said this, that emotions have a collective character, then you're entirely right, Philipp, to start with a question of what makes the premise of this book. I mean, that is, why are emotions more modern or more explosive today than they were? So first, I think what's new to our times is that we view emotions as a source of knowledge and as a source of good. That was not, I think, always the case, certainly not. And I think what has been chiefly responsible for this is psychological culture. Roughly, I think, Freudianism, that is the spread of psychological ideas about the self. I mean, this idea that we are made of a layer of superego, that we have social layers, that we are constrained by societies, and that we need to unpeel these layers and be our true self. These make the emotions a source of goodness and knowledge. Again, I think if you look at the previous eras, it would have been the opposite. Emotions were not reliable. Not reliable, that's the minimum you can say. They were often viewed as a source of evil. And you certainly could not rely on them to make decisions. Whereas I think today we would say, well, what does your heart tell you? What do you feel like? So that's profoundly modern, and it goes along, ironically, with what many sociologists have rightly described as a deep rationalization of the world. So modernity is both things at the same time. You can't understand modernity, I think, if you don't understand these two movements going together. So that means then, if you want, that the inner life becomes a compass. It is the thing that tells us what to do, as opposed to a shared normative framework on what to do. So if you're having a bad time with your husband or your wife, the modern imperative is, what do you actually feel? Not so much what is the proper thing to do, what does your religion, community, and parents will say. And so I think that really what's modern about modern emotions is that we experience emotions in a kind of unmediated way, without those moral, metaphysical, religious frameworks which discarded their importance.
So when I get it right, this is a process that is actually going on maybe since the 19th century, I would say, or?
I would say no.
Even earlier?
No. 19th century for me is the era that Freud describes of great bourgeois self-control. So you're right that there is romanticism, but it remains, I think, no, for me, the process, or what I'm describing, comes into full cultural view after the 1970s. For me, the students' movement, however you want to call it, the 1968 revolution, was marked a major cultural transformation, which of course it didn't emerge full-fledged in the 1970s. Freudianism was at work for a long time already, but all of this happened, the cult of authenticity, the cult of selfhood, the cult of self-realization, it's after the 1970s.
Has this been an emotional culture which was explosive all the time, or is this a new development when you call it explosive modernity?
So I call it explosive modernity for a few reasons. One is, I think that the very fact that, as I said, you become the arbiter of your emotions, and your emotions become indicators. They tell you what you should do. It means that quite often you will use those emotions to enter into conflict with others, to leave relationships, again, as opposed to other ways of negotiating your position in a relationship. So let's imagine you have a friend, and that friend says something that you do not like, and says it a few times. That will be a good reason to stop the relationship for you. And the fact that this friend is an ally, for example, a useful ally, will be less of importance. You will first of all listen to that, to the fact that that person did not make you feel good, or a lover for that matter. I think the problem of recognition in an intimate sexual relationship is extremely important. And one of the things I found in my studies on love is how extremely attentive to oneself people are in a sexual intimate relationship. That means, for example, that if intimate relationship does not make you feel what you would like to feel, that is constantly happy and in a state of well-being, etc., that is a reason to end a relationship. So that's one reason for the explosiveness. Another reason for explosiveness is, I think, what I mentioned before, is the cult of authenticity. And I think we have this view of, we have again a contradictory ethos. There is a high level of self-control, which we must exercise in, for example, the professional arena. And this movement towards self-control, Norbert Elias analyzed it in a beautiful way. He really analyzes how from the 15th century onward in Western civilization there is a movement towards the control of emotions, and how the actor, what we call the actor today, is, we look as if everything that we do now comes to us effortlessly. But in fact, the interactions we have presuppose a great deal of self-control. So that we have on the one hand. And on the other hand, we have the exact opposite, which is an enormous amount of, especially in the leisure sphere, we have an enormous amount of arenas in which we are supposed to let everything down and express our true, authentic self. And I think there was another sociologist, a disciple of Elias, who had called this control, decontrol of emotions, this tension between the two. And so that's how, for example, that person explained the fact that there is a lot of violence on movies, for example. This violence on movies is the result for him, it's a kind of sublimation on a symbolic level of the fact we can no longer, in fact, be violent. So that it's this double movement, I think, of control and decontrol in modern societies, where the decontrol is sometimes sublimated, sometimes not so sublimated. It exists, in fact, in the internet. The internet is this kind of in-between. Think of it as an in-between arena in which you can show all your hatred and violence, which you cannot normally show, but it is in a sublimated, kind of controlled, symbolic arena.
Yeah. So that's the intriguing thing about this claim of authenticity. And that's, I also learned from your book that though we think at the moment we're encouraged to show our true self and our true feelings, so it's something about intimacy. You say at the same time this intimacy and these true feelings are historically and culturally coded at the same time. So though we think that's the most individual thing we can do, if you ask ourselves, is what do you feel? What could be the path for you? It's not what is expected from us. Actually, this claim, so we do what we feel, is something which is also coded historically and culturally.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, there is nothing, in my opinion, more conformist than a bunch of people who think they are deeply anti-conformist and just following their inner voice.
And another thing about that, which somehow struck me as a literary scholar, that you use a lot of literary examples, and you stress it that it's that literary examples ranging from Shakespeare to Flaubert to Houellebecq, going back to Sophocles, that these literary texts can teach you something about these codes of emotion. What can they teach you?
So I think the novel was the precursor of psychology. And we do not remember often, I mean, the novel is so much with us, we don't remember how recent the novel is. Just to make my point, think of how we used to think of a person. I don't know if you know Theophrastus. He was a buddy of Aristotle, and he wrote Characters, a book called The Characters. And this book was really very much in vogue in Europe. 17th century France, La Bruyère, a French moralist, writes a book, Les Caractères. And what is the characters? So Theophrastus has a set of types: the arrogant, the coward, the buffoon. And this is how they look at human beings. You look at human beings according to these fixed types. Now, the novel is going to change completely that way of approaching the human psyche. The novel individualizes a great deal human beings. I mean, human beings don't need to be individuals. They became individuals, among other things, among others, through the novel, because the novel gave you access to the interiority and to the unique trajectory in life of a character. So that's why I say that the novel was the precursor of psychology. So you differentiate a lot individuals, and you give us access to them through their emotions. So the novel is a kind of, presents itself, wants to be a psychological mirror, but it actually shapes interiority. And this is where I get to your question. And I think novels and movies and TV series are extremely important sources to shape the inner life, because think about the inner life. I mean, if I look at you and I think you're very nicely dressed, then I can imitate that, because I can, this is something outward. It exists to my eyes. But I would have no idea, if I wanted to imitate your inner life, I have no idea how to do that, because it's by definition your inner life. So that's what the novel does. The novel gives us access to the inner life of characters. And it does that by presenting in an elaborate way their emotions, which is why, Michel Kohlhaas is the story of a revenge, incredible anger. Madame Bovary is the story of disappointment. Of Belle du Seigneur is a story of romantic love, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, so these lectures actually structure the text also, so you can approach each emotion also by a text, and you explain very instructively and very puzzling to me. Before we dive into that, one added question, because I asked myself, how strong are emotions or concepts of emotions linked to language? So you have the example from the Hebrew. So if you have envy and jealousy, okay, these are two emotions, but in the Hebrew it's kana.
Kina.
Kina. So it's the you can't differ.
Right.
Actually.
Right.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. So if your language doesn't, doesn't allow you to differ, don't you have these emotions as separate ones, or you somehow link them automatically?
I mean, for sure. Of course, emotions are connected to language. In fact, I think sometimes the study of emotions is so associated with words of emotions that it's no longer clear if you're searching the emotion or if you're searching the word of emotion. So that's one thing. But I think your question pertained to whether the experience of, let's say, envy and jealousy, to use this example, is different for an Israeli or for... because they don't have the word, they don't have two separate words. By the way, I think most people are not really aware of the difference. Then they would say, I was jealous of her, when actually they mean to say I was envious of her. So that's another complication, which is that people themselves are not aware of the... So I would say there are, for many emotions, not all of them, some core elements that are some core phenomenological elements that are probably prior to language or don't depend on language. So, for example, envy is typically it is defined as the desire that somebody else would not have something good. Jealousy is typically defined by the fear of losing somebody, the love, for example, of somebody you love. And these are not the same, although one might say they are both maybe connected at a higher level to some conception of ownership, or the fact that you should accumulate or have things. I don't know, but I would say this is an important difference between jealousy and envy, and I would say probably Israelis are able to differentiate between these two types of experiences, even though they do not have different words.
Yeah. So we go into the text,
Yes.
and we start also with something outstanding, because you start with hope. And actually, from my point of view, I always thought, okay, hope, this is such a trivial word, a trivial concept, somehow an inescapable emotion. I also thought maybe there is not a possibility to conceive any modern society in which hope does not form part of an emotional foundation somehow. Is that true, or are there societies where hope does not form somehow, part of an emotional foundation, or are we already living in something like that?
So I think you're right to raise the question. So first of all, just to make it clear, the book starts with the emotion of hope, and there is an arc that takes us. You know, it's I don't remember how many chapters, but there are 12 emotions, I think, that although it's not 12 chapters, but it's 12 emotions. And I try to follow a kind of narrative thread. And that narrative thread, that story, starts with hope. Because I think Kant's question, what can I reasonably hope for, is in fact a founding gesture of modernity. But before I go into that, you're right. There is something trivial about hope, and it is trivial because it is, you could say, embedded in language. The very fact that all languages, I think, practically have a future tense, I will, already contain the emotion of hope that is embedded in language and in ordinary action. But I meant in the book hope in a much more dramatic, if you want, melodramatic way. I think hope is is the founding gesture of modernity, because it is fundamentally modernity is fundamentally based on the fantasy, or the idea of progress. And not only is it based on the idea of progress, but it is based on the the idea that once you move from God to human beings, that is, once you move from the idea that God determines our action to the idea that human beings shape themselves and make themselves, then you move to a much more radically voluntaristic view of human beings. Voluntaristic view means that humans shape their life. Not only they shape their life, but they can and they should shape their life. So that kind of voluntarism becomes added to individualism. So that's one of the things I think that makes hope so cardinal to modernity. And then there is another thing, which is then you build these narratives about the self, like what's called the American dream. The American dream is essentially a new secular theology to shape yourself. And it is what defines meritocracy, the idea that if I work hard enough, if I do what I should do, then my life will be happy and successful. That's an incredibly hopeful narrative. And and we spend all our lives, in fact, think about, I don't know, people who end up swallowing a lot of psychiatric medicine, or going to psychiatrists, or going to the psychologist. These are people who end up actually dealing with the fact that their lives, our lives, just don't go that way usually.
So politically, actually, we are supposed to, or we used to perceive hope as a somehow positive emotion, but actually, after reading your book, one can realize that hope can also be a quite depressing, or how to say, bereaving emotion. Since we're as long as we have hope, we could say, okay, maybe nothing has to change. So it can stabilize also quite unhealthy societies and governments. If people have enough hope, something will change somehow without something does actually change.
Yeah. I just want to just say something, and I will answer your remark. So the future is always, or not always, but definitely in Christianity or in Judaism or in Islam, the future is fundamental. But usually it takes the form of salvation. Salvation, and of course, salvation fantasies contain in themselves hope. What's different about modern hope, and I just wanted to make it clear, is that hope narrative is completely grounded on the action of the human being, and so that's why it's no longer really a salvation narrative. It is a hope narrative, that it is the hope that the human being has for him or herself. One of the ways in which, this is to answer your question, I structured the book, and in this way I also answer your previous remark about my use of literature, is that every single emotion for me is highly ambivalent. And in this way, I am very different from philosophers or psychologists. So philosophers or psychologists will tell you anger is bad for you. Seneca says that anger actually brought down the fall of Seneca, the Stoic philosopher, Roman philosopher, brought down great cities. Martha Nussbaum concurs, and she says, yes, anger is bad. And then, or she would say, Martha Nussbaum would say, great philosopher of emotion, she would say, love is great, good emotion. And I don't do it at all. I take the exact opposite view, namely that every single emotion from a social standpoint can be good or bad, can have functional or dysfunctional effects, and you cannot have a more normative approach to emotions. That is the reason why, when I approach hope, I view in hope very different or contrasting properties. One is that hope can be and is often, for example, used as a resource in political struggles. Václav Havel, for example, was one of the great writers, and he performed that kind of hope, where he distinguished, for example, between optimism and hope. Václav Havel said, I don't think it was his, actually, he took it from somebody else, but I don't remember who. But he said, for example, optimism is a kind of calculation of what good things might happen. Hope is believing against even, very difficult conditions. In that sense, there is something almost religious in hope. And the Christians, the Catholic Espérance, actually formalize this very well. So that's one thing. Hope is something that keeps us above the conditions of our lives. But there is something about hope also, and here I use Henry James' marvelous short story called The Beast in the Jungle, about a man who is waiting for something extraordinary to happen to him. He waits, and at some point an old friend of his, comes and lives near him. She loves him, and they live together, but he does not really respond to her love. At some point, she dies. She dies, and after she dies, he goes to her tomb, I think, and then he realizes that the thing that he had been waiting for, he has missed. It was the love of this woman, and this is the beast in the jungle that jumps over him. So that kind of hope, this kind of useless hope, sterile hope that structures his life, is for me the pretext to think about the category of empty hope that keeps going this enormous engine of self-development culture.
Yeah. So you talked already about the anger, which also found quite fascinating, since Eva Illouz explains anger reading Clyde's Michael Kohlhaas. So you can learn from that actually anger is always somehow bound to morality. There has to be a moral aspect. If you're angry, so something which there's a set of rules or institutions that are heard, so you have to be. So you're angry because the moral standards are wounded and you have to restore them, and this is what we call also the righteous anger, gerechter Zorn, but it's always somehow a paradox movement. Since we do not have that much time, I would like to address two other emotions which are quite important. The first one is fear. Simple question: are we living in a time of fear? Is this a time where societies of fear, somehow grow and expand?
Yeah, the short answer is yes. Mm-hmm. Should I elaborate?
Yeah, why? We can feel it somehow. We have to know. We have to know why we feel it. Yeah.
So I mean, I think the promise of modernity is a life of security. I mean, the modern state promises security. And in fact, this pressure on the state goes, I think, and increases. I mean, if you look at even the rise of insurance companies, the insurance industry really reflects what I'm talking about. I mean, this idea that you are, that you are guaranteed something against risk, something like that. So the insurance industry gives us a sense of what it means to be a modern subject, that you are you do not take risk. If you do, then they are compensated, and so on and so forth. And in fact, modern medicine, think about the obsession about preventing diseases, health food, exercise, in order to offset the fear of disease. So you could say we are supposed to, that we live in a world that very much tries to provide conditions of life in which the emergence of fear is not possible. And yet, I think it's exactly the opposite that happens. And the opposite happens, among other things, because precisely the function of the state is increasingly, in relying on experts, is increasingly to prevent. The state is increasingly about not taking risk, assessing risks. It's a precautionary sensibility. It is taking precautions so that very bad things will not happen. I think COVID was an extraordinary example of, I don't know if you remember, in hindsight, this world panic. 5 billion people came to a halt, stayed in their home, in a state of total panic. We washed neurotically our tables, our glasses with, disinfectant. We cleaned our hands. We wore masks. Overnight, we changed our behavior in a way that has no precedent. I mean, we have to understand this. It has no precedent in the history of mankind, this behavior and this world-scale panic, which was highly synchronized. This is not despite the promise of security, it is because of the promise of security. So in a sense, the more secure we are, the more paradoxically scared we are.
Yeah. I remember that. I remember this time, I have to say. And the strange thing is the quickness in which we changed back. So the virus is still around somehow. So it's puzzling, actually. One important thing I guess I should address too. It's about nostalgia. Nostalgia is I think the final chapter in this book is about nostalgia.
No, there are 2 more or 3 more chapters.
Yeah, right. Okay, but actually the German version has a different how to say segregation between the chapters. They have Okay, but okay, it's doesn't matter. It's something else, because nostalgia, in my point of view, is it's linked somehow to modernity. Nostalgia. So modernity has always been involved with nostalgia. Due to the uprooting the modern man has to live through. So there's uprooting, so you don't have somehow what you call with Lukács transzendentale Obdachlosigkeit. And so nostalgia is always longing for home, for something where everything is settled. And we know all that actually this emotion of nostalgia is very often, and meanwhile very commonly, abused worldwide by nationalist movements, especially. And my question would be: is there anything left to salvage from this emotion of nostalgia? Or how should we address this longing for a home now, politically? Should we ignore it, or should we address it in another way?
So in the chapter, and this goes back to our discussion about words, I make a distinction between nostalgia and homelessness. Homelessness seems to me it's an emotion that doesn't have a word, I think, in most languages. And it strikes me that it is the emotion that is probably also at the center of one of the founding myths of our civilization, which is the myth of Odysseus. When you think of it, it's quite remarkable that Odysseus is offered to stay on an island with Calypso, to have a life of eternity, and to have a life of eternal love and sex. What else can be bad? I mean, cannot be bad. But he chooses not to. He chooses to go back to his old wife. Penelope, for sure, became old by the time he comes back. And that's because, I mean, I think Odysseus profoundly tells us something about the fact that to be a human being is to belong to a place. And that Odysseus understood that however worshipped he would be by Calypso, by the nymph Calypso, it would not be a full life. And that is definitely in resonance with how the ancient Greeks understood human life as belonging to living political and human community. So homelessness is very central. I think the fear of homelessness is actually something that haunts our times because so many people move around. It's not only the migrants who come from difficult countries. It's also us who are moving around constantly and who are doing our best, in fact, to live very far in conditions sometimes of exile from our homes. So homelessness quite often produces some very diffuse and confused feeling, which is not only connected to spatial displacement, it is also connected to the change that your environment undergoes. So, when small villages in Italy, for example, when you see that Italian leather maker closed down and they are bought again by Chinese shop owners, you don't need to be somebody from the extreme right to simply feel a sense of discomfort because you do not know, because suddenly you have Chinese restaurants and you have Chinese stuff that you don't know. Or for me, I can tell you that every time a shop closes down and I see a big brand like Gap or Zara or H&M come instead, I feel deeply alienated. I really do. I feel really deeply alienated. So that sense of homelessness has become, I think, a permanent feature of our lives. Things change too much, too fast. I'm pretty sure, although I usually make a career of saying I'm not sure of most things, I'm pretty sure human beings are not built that much for so much change so quickly. It doesn't do good. What it does then, this is what I say in the chapter you refer to, is that it is recoded as nostalgia. This confused sense of disorientation that many of us feel is recoded as nostalgia, that is, as a kind of longing for a time and a world in which there was more of a sense of order and belonging. And actually, I think, in the book I refer mostly to the extreme right use of that sense of nostalgia, but honestly, it's not only the extreme right. I think we all long for that kind of world.
Actually, that's a good last word. Would you? Okay. Thank Eva for being here. Thank you for talking to us. And okay, read that book, buy it outside. Okay.